Okay, so we were talking about adult versus fetal hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin is kind of like what it sounds, right? So it's hemoglobin that's present in fetal RBCs, okay? At birth, we start to, production of this protein goes down, decrease in production at birth. Okay, so then by the time maybe around 6 months, the baby doesn't make it anymore. What it does, why we have it, it has a stronger affinity for oxygen than regular hemoglobin. So think about it. So here's the mom, right? Which this my pregnant lady, right? Bad. And then here's the baby. So the mom and the baby are competing for the same oxygen. So what happens is the baby makes fetal hemoglobin, which has a stronger affinity for oxygen than the mom's blood. So it's able to carry the oxygen a little bit better until the baby's born. And then after it's born, there's no competition, right? So the gene is turned off. We have a decrease in production. And then after 6 months, in most cases, they're not making fetal hemoglobin anymore. They're making regular adult hemoglobin. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so it's in the fetus. It's better at holding oxygen. Okay, now erythrocytes and hemoglobin. Okay, so red blood cell count and hemoglobin concentration tell us how much oxygen you can actually carry. Okay, and we can measure that a couple different ways, and we'll actually do these in the blood lab. So the first one I have on here is hematocrit, and I had a slide of that in the very first PowerPoint notes. So it's a measurement, it's percent red blood cells in total blood. Okay, so in men, it's typically 42 to 52%, and in women, it's 37 to 48%. You're going to memorize those for lab. Okay, then we can also measure the hemoglobin concentration. So there's a little machine that you can use that you can determine how much of the protein is actually in there. Now we measure that in grams per deciliter. Okay, so DL equals deciliter. Okay, so men normally have between 13 and 18 grams per deciliter, and women have less, so 12 to 16. Another way to determine how many red blood cells have is we do a red blood cell count. So we actually put them on a slide and we count them with a machine called a hemocytometer, which kind of makes sense, right? Cyto, and then meter, a hemocytometer. And it's actually automated now too. So you can figure out, so men between 4.6 and 6.2 and women 4.2 to 5.4. Okay, now here's the question. Why are the values lower in women? So one thing is androgen, so testosterone, it stimulates red blood cell production. Okay, so it's going to trigger you to make more red blood cells, men to make more red blood cells, or if you're a female and you're taking it, it's going to cause you to make more red blood cells in the bone marrow. Okay, women have periodic menstrual losses, so we lose blood through menstruation. So then we have to rebuild that blood, have to rebuild it, okay, the blood supply. And then here's hematocrit is inversely proportional to the percentage of body fat. So traditionally, women have more body fat. So more body fat, less red blood cells. Okay, so here is, I tried to use an old slide to see how the red blood cells are produced because there's so much on that other slide, it's just hard to see. Okay, so here's the pluripotent stem cells, which they also call the hemocytoblast. Okay, and this is how we make red blood cells. So erythropoiesis. Okay, so the poiesis is blood production. Okay, so red blood cell production. Okay, so here's the hemocytoblast. So it could become any cell. Okay, there's a cellular signal that tells it to become an erythrocyte. You don't need to know the cellular signal. Just know, okay, something happens, it's going to cause it to become a red blood cell. Okay, now, what's going to happen is we make this erythrocyte CFU, so CFU is colony forming unit. Okay, and then that progresses to become an erythroblast, and then it'll become a reticulocyte, and eventually it's going to leave the bone marrow, and it becomes an erythrocyte. Okay, so precursor cells, this is in the bone marrow. Okay, now here's what I have written underneath of it. Okay, so this is a crazy number. So we're making 2.5 million red blood cells per second. So that is just crazy, right? We're making 2.5 million a second. Okay, because they don't have a nucleus and they don't have mitochondria, right? They only live about 120 days. Okay, and then they're going to die. They're going to break down. So that's important. It takes 3 to 5 days for them to develop. And what's going to happen is the cell's going to get smaller. We get more of them. We have to make hemoglobin, and we have to lose the nucleus. Okay, so here's what I have. So the first committed cell is the erythrocyte colony forming unit. Okay, now it has receptors for this hormone, which is called erythropoietin, or EPO. And EPO is going to come from the kidneys, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. The erythroblasts, okay, so blasts are like baby cells. So I always think blast is baby cells. They multiply, they make hemoglobin, then we get rid of the nucleus, okay, and then we form the reticulocyte. And then the reticulocyte becomes the erythrocyte. So sometimes, if someone is anemic, these reticulocytes are let out of the bone marrow before they're ready to go. So they can be let out before they're mature. So that can be an indication that something is wrong if that reticulocyte number in the blood is greater than 0.5 to 1.5. Okay, so here's the idea, okay? This guy has receptors, okay, for EPO. Okay, so EPO is going to be the hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. Okay, it gets stimulated, it starts to become an erythroblast. Okay, erythroblasts are going to divide, and they're going to lose the nucleus. Okay, they kick out the nucleus, then they become a reticulocyte. And then from a reticulocyte, we become an erythrocyte. Okay. Let's see. What do you need for red blood cell production? You have to have iron. Okay, so you have to have iron in your diet. Okay, we lose iron a lot. Okay, so we lose it in our urine, we use it in our feces, and through like menstruation or any bleeding if someone's hemorrhaging. This is how much we lose a day. So men lose about 0.9 milligrams a day, and women lose 1.7 milligrams a day. Okay, iron is hard for our intestines to absorb. So the low absorption rate of iron requires us to consume between 5 and 20 milligrams a day. Okay, so what happens is dietary iron can be in two forms. Okay, so it can be Fe, so that's iron, ferric, or it could be ferrous. So Fe3 plus or Fe2 plus. Okay, so it could be either ion. What happens is the stomach acid will actually convert the ferric iron to iron that's ferrous so that we can absorb it. There's a protein, gastroferritin. It binds the ferrous iron, and it transports it to the small intestine. Okay, and then it's going to get absorbed into the blood and then to the bone marrow or the liver or wherever it needs to go. Okay, so it's just I actually don't require you to memorize all of this. I think if you take nutrition, you go through all of this, but I want you to know that you have to have iron. Okay, and we do lose a lot of it, and it's hard to absorb. Okay, the other things that we have to have is we have to have B12 and folic acid. So B12 and folic acid are essential for rapid cell division. Okay, so rapid cell division is part of, like, if you have to make 2.5 million cells per second, you need you need the supplies to do it with. You also need copper and vitamin C. So these are cofactors for enzymes that make hemoglobin. Okay, then here's the feedback cycle. So the boxes in here are all highlighted, and this is from your book. Okay, so the stimulus is decreased blood oxygen levels. So lots of times we say this is hypoxia. Okay, so hypo, right? Anything that's hypo is low. And oxia, right? That's going to be oxygen. So hypoxia. So what kinds of things could cause low oxygen, right? So you could be at a higher elevation. You could be hemorrhaging. You could be anemic. Maybe you have a respiratory problem. Okay, all of those things can cause hypoxia or decreased oxygen in the blood. Okay, now the receptor is going to be the kidneys. Okay, so they're going to detect low oxygen. The control center is the kidneys again, and they release EPO. Okay, so the EPO is this little blue thing, right? And it's going to circulate in the blood. Okay, and it's going to actually travel to the erythrocytes in the bone marrow. Okay, so EPO stimulates red bone marrow to increase the rate of production of erythrocytes. Okay, so we start making more red blood cells. Then what's going to happen? They're going to get dumped into the bloodstream. Okay, we're going to carry more oxygen, so RBCs go up, oxygen goes up, and then we reverse the stimulus. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so stimulus, low oxygen. Receptors are in the kidneys, control centers are the kidneys, and the hormone is the EPO. Okay, then the effector is going to be what's going to cause the change to occur. So EPO is going to cause the change to occur in the bone marrow. Okay, we're going to make more red blood cells that can carry more oxygen. Okay, and then we're going to stop making, we don't need to make any more EPO. Okay, and then we've reversed the stimulus. Okay, so you have to know this. You have to know it. Okay, now, some people got in trouble with blood doping. Okay, so think Lance Armstrong or competitive cycling. You can go in and you could Google blood doping. Lance Armstrong comes up. Some of you guys are young though. Okay, so what these like Tour de France bicyclers were doing is they were injecting EPO. Okay, so they would inject EPO, and that would stimulate the production of more red blood cells. Okay, so they make more red blood cells, they could carry more oxygen, they could bike for longer distances. And EPO was something that was naturally occurred in the body, and they weren't checking these other, they weren't, at first they weren't onto it. Eventually they figured it out, and they were able to detect it. Then they started collecting their own blood. So they take blood cells, red blood cells out, and when they were racing, they'd be putting them in as they were racing. Okay, so what could be problems with that? It'll increase the viscosity of the blood. Okay, if it increases the viscosity, that puts you more at risk for heart attack and stroke. Okay, now you're making 2.5 million per second. Okay, so how do you get rid of them, right? They don't have a nucleus, they don't have any DNA, they don't make proteins, they don't have mitochondria. They're like bags of hemoglobin. So how do you get rid of them? Okay, so death and disposal. So here's the reminder: they form in the bone marrow. They circulate for about 120 days. The organ that's going to get rid of them, that's key in that, is the spleen. Okay, so as they get older, they get stiff. Okay, so instead of being these nice little floppy sacs, they get stiff and they stick in capillaries and they get broken down. They tend to stick in the spleen, Okay, and there are macrophages in there. Okay, so there are big white blood cells in there that'll gobble them up. Okay, so it digests them. So if that's the red blood cell, a macrophage comes in, gobbles it up, starts breaking it down. Now, we want to recycle. Okay, we want to recycle as much of the red blood cells as we can. So we're going to recycle the amino acids, okay, from the globin. We're going to try to hang on to the iron. And then the heme. Okay, the heme is the pigment. So the heme is the color. So it's cool because the heme, okay, which starts out red, okay, it gets converted to biliverdin, which is green. Okay, and if you think about old blood, if you see old blood laying somewhere, it kind of looks brownish green. Okay, now biliverdin, the green, is actually converted to bilirubin, which is yellow. Okay, bilirubin gets converted taken to the liver, okay, and it gets released in the bile, and bile is green. So bilirubin becomes urobilin, and that becomes stercobilin, and that's what actually makes your poop brown. Okay, some urobilin gets picked back up by the blood, and it becomes urobilin, which actually makes urine yellow. So basically, the heme from your hemoglobin is what makes your urine yellow and your poop brown, the breakdown products of it. Okay, so you should understand that. Okay, now the iron. Oh, here's the video. This video explains it. I can't show you on here, but when you look at the PowerPoint and you open it to view it as slides, you'll be able to play this video, and it goes through hemoglobin breakdown. It's from your book. Okay, now, problems with red blood cells. Okay, so erythrocyte disorders. Okay, so polycythemia is having too many red blood cells. Okay, so too many in there. So primary polycythemia is lots of times it's a cancer of the erythropoietic cells. Okay, so it's bad. Okay, so the primary cause is you have a cancer in the cells that are going to become the red blood cells. So the hematocrit, instead of being at 50%, could go up to 80%. Okay, so they would do like probably a bone marrow transplant. Secondary polycythemia could be if you're dehydrated. Okay, the amount of plasma you have will go down. Okay, when that goes down, then your blood becomes more concentrated. Okay, emphysema. So emphysema is a COPD. So it's a chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder or disease. So if you can't, what happens is if your body can't detect the oxygen, like if you're not getting enough oxygen into your blood, your body doesn't know that there's something wrong with your lungs. Okay, it thinks that you need more blood cells. So it's going to try to make more blood cells rather than, it doesn't know to fix your lungs. Okay, being at a high altitude like Mount Everest or something like that, or like Denver, Colorado, you'll end up making more, you'll make more CO2, or not CO2, more oxygen. Okay, physical conditioning, the more you exercise. Okay, so now think about like the Olympics. Okay, lots of times athletes go to Denver to train. Okay, they go to high altitudes to train. So what they're doing to their body, okay, the oxygen is like, they say it's thinner at high altitudes. Okay, so when they go to these places to train, what happens is the stimulus occurs. Okay, so the people become hypoxic. They become hypoxic, EPO gets released naturally, okay, and they make more red blood cells naturally. Okay, so then they can carry more oxygen. So then they have increased oxygen capacity, which would be useful if you're going to go, when you go back to sea level and you go compete somewhere, you'll have more red blood cells than everybody else. Okay, now dangers of it. Okay, it increases your blood volume. Okay, it can increase your blood pressure. It can increase the viscosity. So it could lead to a clot where you don't want it. It could lead to stroke. It could lead to a heart attack. But sometimes athletes, if you read Lance Arm, there's books about blood doping in the Tour de France. If you read them, these guys were, it's crazy. They put in a lot of red blood cells in order to win. Okay, now anemia. Anemia is low red blood cells. Okay, so I have three main categories. So first one is for some reason you're not making enough. Okay, so you're either not making enough red blood cells or you're not making enough hemoglobin. Okay, so it could be because your kidneys don't work and you're not making EPO. Okay, it could be due to your diet. Okay, so if it's in your diet, it could be because you don't have enough iron. Okay, it could also be that you don't have enough B12. Okay, now we'll talk about this more in the digestive tract or chapter, but B12 it binds to this protein which is called intrinsic factor. Okay, so B12 has to bind to intrinsic factor in order to be absorbed. Okay, intrinsic factor is only found in your stomach. So if something's wrong, or maybe you had, if something's wrong and you don't have enough B12 or you don't have enough intrinsic factor, you can acquire what they call pernicious anemia. Okay, so it's a different kind of anemia. Okay, now hypoplastic anemia means for some reason your red blood cell production is going down, so that could be actually from aging. And then aplastic anemia, sometimes that's caused by like radiation poisoning or you're exposed to chemicals and something happens and you just totally stop making red blood cells. Okay, so that's the first one. So you don't have enough cells or you don't have enough hemoglobin. The second one is you're bleeding. Okay, so a hemorrhagic anemia. Okay, so it could be maybe you're bleeding from your intestines or you're just hemorrhaging. Okay, the third one is hemolytic. So this could be, I always think Ebola, okay, or yeah, Ebola. Okay, so something's happening. You have a virus or you have a toxin in you that is actually causing your blood cells to break. Or in sickle cell, which we'll talk about, sickle cell is actually genetic and the red blood cells break. So hemolytic, the cells are lysing. Okay, now anemia has three consequences. So one is your tissue becomes hypoxic and then it could die. So patient's tired, they have shortness of breath. Okay, the blood osmolarity is reduced and then fluid accumulates in the tissue. And the blood is really thin. So the heart can race, blood pressure drops, and you could have a heart attack. Okay, now sickle cell is a genetic type of anemia which causes, okay, so if you guys remember gene, right, a gene and then protein. Okay, so what's happening is there is a mutation in the hemoglobin protein gene. So the protein, instead of being this nice, like four-shaped thing that we looked at in the other picture, it's not shaped like this. And so when you get a whole bunch of them in these floppy cells, they become sickle-shaped. Okay, so it's a recessive trait. It modifies the structure of the hemoglobin molecule. They symbolize it with HB with a capital S. It's one amino acid difference. So it's a really crazy mutation, because it's not a lot. It's just the wrong thing in the wrong place. Okay, so what happens is that they can't carry oxygen. The red blood cells become sickle shaped, okay, or crescent moon shaped. Okay, and because of this, they stick. They have a hard time going through capillaries. So they can block blood vessels. They can put someone into a sickle cell crisis. The spleen usually gets enlarged. Lots of pain. They've come up with different ways of treating it. Sometimes they'll do like they'll take blood out and do a transfusion to replace it to try to dilute the sickles. There are other ways that they try to treat it now. Okay, but it's around. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that people that have sickle cell are more resistant to malaria. So it does, in areas where there's malaria, there are some benefits to having the sickles. Okay, so I think that's it.